He didn't invite her to remember the past. He invited her to become the joke. The chandelier lights spilled across the marble floor like liquid gold as laughter echoed through the ballroom, sharp and polished, the kind that didn't ask permission before cutting deep. And at the center of it all stood Ryan Cole, perfectly tailored in a midnight tuxedo, one hand wrapped around a glass of champagne, the other casually resting on the waist of a woman who wasn't Evelyn, his smile easy, practiced, almost rehearsed, as if tonight had been written long before it ever happened. She might actually show up, someone murmured near him, and Ryan chuckled under his breath, tilting his head just slightly. "I hope she does," he said, his voice low but deliberate, meant to travel just far enough. It'd be a shame if she missed seeing what she lost. And just like that, the room absorbed the intention, the quiet cruelty disguised as charm. Guests exchanged knowing glances, a few lips curved into restrained smiles, the kind that pretended not to judge while doing exactly that. And then the doors opened, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough for a shift in the air to ripple through the crowd. And for a brief second, the music felt softer, like the room itself hesitated. Evelyn Carter stepped inside wearing a black dress that didn't beg for attention but commanded it anyway, the fabric simple, precise, falling just below her knees, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. And for a moment, no one spoke, because there was something unsettling about the way she moved, not hesitant, not defensive, just steady, as if she had already lived through whatever they thought tonight would do to her. Ryan noticed her almost instantly, his smile tightening just a fraction before returning, smoother this time, sharper. He raised his glass slightly in her direction, a silent acknowledgement that wasn't kindness, wasn't welcome, just ownership of the moment. Like he still believed he controlled the narrative. Whispers began threading through the room, soft but fast. "That's her. She actually came. I thought she'd hide." And Evelyn heard them. Of course she did, but her steps didn't change, her breathing didn't falter, her eyes didn't search for approval or escape. They simply moved across the room until they found Ryan. And when they did, she didn't look angry. She didn't look hurt. She just looked finished. Like whatever version of her he had once known no longer existed in this space. Ryan took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze locking onto hers as if waiting for something. A reaction, a crack, anything that would prove she was still the same woman he had left behind. But Evelyn didn't give him that. She stopped a few feet away, close enough for the tension to settle between them like invisible glass, unbroken but undeniable. And for a second, the entire room seemed to lean in without moving. Waiting, expecting, hoping for the scene Ryan had promised them without saying a word, but Evelyn only offered the faintest smile, not warm, not cold, just distant, like a memory that no longer belonged to him. And in that quiet, in that unbearable stillness, something shifted, something Ryan couldn't quite name yet, because this wasn't the reaction he had planned for. And somewhere deep beneath the polished surface of his confidence, a flicker of uncertainty began to form, small, almost invisible, but enough to suggest that tonight might not unfold the way he intended it all. Ryan let the silence stretch just long enough to regain control, or at least that was what he told himself as he lowered his glass and took a step closer to Evelyn, his smile returning. With that familiar edge, the one she used to mistake for confidence, but now saw for what it was, a performance built for an audience. "I was not sure you would come," he said lightly, his voice carrying just enough for the people nearby to hear, and they did, their attention sharpening like a spotlight tightening around them. Evelyn did not answer right away. Her gaze moved briefly past him, taking in the room, the polished marble, the towering floral arrangements, the expensive ease of people who had never been left behind like she had. And then her eyes returned to him, steady, unhurried. "You sent an invitation," she said simply, her voice calm, almost quiet, but it landed heavier than anything louder ever could. A few guests exchanged glances, sensing something was off script. Ryan gave a soft laugh, tilting his head, as if amused. "I did not think you would take it seriously," he replied, and the woman at his side smiled politely, though her fingers tightened slightly against his arm, as if she could feel the shift too. Evelyn noticed that detail, the way the woman leaned just a fraction closer to Ryan, not out of affection, but instinct, like someone bracing against a sudden drop. "I take very few things seriously." "Now," Evelyn said, and there was no bitterness in her tone, only a kind of clarity that made it harder to dismiss. Ryan studied her more carefully. This time, searching for the version of her he remembered, the one who would have tried to explain herself, to defend, to hold on to something that was already gone. But she did not offer him any of that. Instead, she stood there composed, as if this room no longer had the power to define her, and that unsettled him more than anger ever could. "Well, you picked an interesting night to show up," he said, gesturing subtly around them. "Everyone here knows who you are." The implication lingered, unspoken but obvious, and for a moment the whispers grew just slightly louder, like a low current moving through the crowd. Evelyn could feel it, the weight of their curiosity, their quiet judgment, but she did not shrink from it. Instead, she let her shoulders relax, just enough to look effortless. "That is all right," she said, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "I know who I am too." And something in the way she said it made the air feel different, not heavier, not lighter, just changed, like a shift in temperature that no one could explain. Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but paused just briefly, because for the first time that night, he realized he did not fully understand the woman standing in front of him anymore, and that uncertainty settled deeper than he expected. He lifted his glass again, taking a slow sip to buy himself a second to recalibrate, to return to the version of this evening he had planned. But as he looked at her again, something in his expression flickered, not doubt exactly, but something close to it, because Evelyn Carter was not reacting the way she was supposed to, and somewhere beyond the polished doors of the ballroom, unseen and unannounced, something else was about to enter this carefully constructed stage. The music resumed, but it no longer filled the room the same way, as if something invisible had stepped between each note, softening it, dulling its shine, while Evelyn stood there unmoved. And Ryan felt it, even if he refused to show it, because moments ago this had been simple, predictable, controlled, and now it was not. He shifted slightly, straightening his jacket as though that alone could restore the balance he believed he owned. "You look different," he said, finally, the words slipping out before he could polish them into something sharper, and for the first time, it was not a line meant for the crowd. It was quieter, almost personal. Evelyn held his gaze, not with challenge, not with softness, but with something steadier than both. "I am," she replied, and there was no explanation offered, no attempt to make him understand, just a truth placed between them like a closed door. Ryan exhaled a short breath through his nose, half amused, half unsettled. "You always did have a way of making things sound simple," he said, but there was less certainty behind it now, as if the rhythm he relied on had slipped just enough to throw him off. And the woman beside him adjusted her posture again, her smile still present, but no longer effortless, her eyes flickering between them, as though trying to follow a conversation she had not been prepared for. Around them the room pretended not to watch, but every glance lingered a fraction too long, every conversation paused just slightly too often, because something was happening here, something that did not match the version of the night Ryan had been quietly promising them. Evelyn took a small step back, not retreating, just creating space, the kind that said she did not belong to this moment the way they expected her to. Her hand brushed lightly against the side of her dress, a subtle, grounding gesture as her eyes moved once more across the room, not searching, but observing, like someone taking inventory of a place that no longer held power over her. And then for a brief second her gaze shifted toward the entrance, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to suggest she was aware of something beyond this exchange. Ryan followed that movement instinctively, his eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced toward the doors, but nothing had changed, nothing yet. And still something about the way she had looked there unsettled him more than anything she had said. "You came alone," he pointed out, his tone regaining a hint of its earlier edge, as if he had found a piece of ground he could stand on again. Evelyn returned her attention to him, and for the first time her smile deepened just slightly, not wider, just more certain. "Did I?" she said softly, and the question lingered in the air longer than it should have, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way she said them, calm, assured, like someone who already knew how this night would end. Ryan frowned almost imperceptibly, the expression gone as quickly as it appeared, but not before it revealed something real beneath the surface. And then, just as he was about to respond, the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened again, this time, not quietly, not unnoticed. A shift moved through the room, immediate, unmistakable. Conversation stopped, heads turned, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath as footsteps echoed across the marble floor, slow, measured, deliberate, And Evelyn did not turn right away. She did not need to, because the faintest change in her expression already said everything that was about to happen. The sound of footsteps did not rush. They did not hesitate. They moved with a certainty that did not need to announce itself, yet somehow commanded every eye in the room to follow. And as the figure crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted in a way no music or laughter could recover from. Conversations faded mid-sentence, glasses paused halfway to lips, and even the servers standing along the walls seemed to straighten, as if responding to something instinctive, something unspoken. Ryan turned fully, this time his attention no longer divided, and for the first time that night his expression did not immediately return to control, because he recognized that presence before he could even place the name. The tailored charcoal suit, the measured pace, the quiet authority that did not ask for space, but simply took it. Sebastian Vaughn did not look around the room the way others did. He did not search for approval or acknowledgement. His gaze moved with purpose until it found one person, and one person only. Evelyn had already turned by then, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. But there was something softer beneath it now, not vulnerability, not relief, just recognition, like a moment that had been expected rather than hoped for. Sebastian stopped a few steps in front of her, the distance between them precise, deliberate, as if even that had been considered, and then, without hesitation, he offered his hand, not grand, not dramatic, just steady. Evelyn placed her hand in his, and the gesture was simple, but the effect was not, because it was not the act itself that held weight, it was what it revealed. The room felt it instantly, the quiet recalibration of everything they thought they understood. Ryan stood still, his mind catching up to what his eyes were already telling him, his grip tightening slightly around the stem of his glass as realization began to settle in, slow and heavy, like something he could not interrupt, could not rewrite. The woman beside him shifted again, this time more noticeably, her composure slipping just enough to betray the tension beneath it. "Good evening," Sebastian said, his voice even controlled, carrying just far enough to reach those closest without needing to rise, and there was no performance in it, no hidden edge, just a calm that came from never needing to prove anything. Evelyn met his gaze. "You are right on time," she replied, and there was the faintest hint of something warmer in her tone, something that had not been there when she spoke to Ryan, not because she was trying to show it, but because she did not need to hide it. Sebastian's attention moved briefly past her toward Ryan, not dismissive, not confrontational, simply aware, and in that brief glance the hierarchy of the room rewrote itself without a single word being spoken. Ryan felt it before anyone else, the subtle shift from host to observer, from control to uncertainty, and it settled in his chest in a way that no amount of practiced confidence could smooth over, because this was not a situation he could charm his way through, not anymore. Evelyn withdrew her hand slowly, not abruptly, just enough to signal that the moment had already been established, and she did not need to hold on to it to prove anything. Her eyes moved back to Ryan, not with triumph, not with accusation, but with something quieter, something final, like a chapter that no longer required explanation. And in that silence, heavier, now more deliberate, Ryan understood what the room was beginning to realize. This was never his stage to begin with, and whatever came next was not his to control. Ryan forced a smile, but it no longer carried the same ease. It felt tighter, controlled in a way that suggested effort rather than instinct, as he set his glass down carefully on a passing tray, buying himself a second to recalibrate, to reconstruct the version of himself that had never been questioned in rooms like this. "Mr. Vaughn," he said, stepping forward, his tone respectful but measured, as if he could still place himself somewhere within the hierarchy that had just shifted beneath his feet. "I did not expect you tonight." Sebastian's gaze settled on him fully, now not dismissive, not warm, simply direct, the kind of attention that did not rush because it never needed to. "Plans change," he replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any elaborate explanation ever could. Ryan gave a short nod, his mind moving quickly, searching for footing, for something familiar he could hold onto. "Of course, well, it is an honor to have you here. This is a smaller event, but we are proud of what we have built." He gestured lightly around the room, as if reclaiming ownership of the space might steady him. Sebastian followed the gesture, briefly, his eyes taking in the polished surroundings before returning to Ryan. "You have done well with what you were given," he said, and the phrasing was subtle but precise enough to draw a quiet line between effort and authority. A few nearby guests exchanged glances, catching the nuance, even if they did not fully understand it. Evelyn remained still beside them, her presence calm, almost detached, as if she were watching a scene she had already seen before, not in this exact form, but in essence and outcome. Ryan felt it again, that quiet imbalance, that sense that something was happening just beyond his control, and it pressed against the edges of his composure. "And how do you two know each other?" he asked, finally, the question coming out smoother than he felt, but carrying a curiosity that was no longer casual. The room seemed to lean in again, the silence returning, not forced, but inevitable. Evelyn turned her head slightly towards Sebastian, not asking, not prompting, simply allowing him the space to answer if he chose to. Sebastian's expression did not change, but there was a faint shift in his gaze, something more personal, more deliberate. "Evelyn is someone I trust," he said, and the words were not loud, but they landed with a clarity that moved through the room like a ripple. Trust, not acquaintance, not coincidence, something deeper, something that implied history, that implied choice. Ryan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he absorbed that, the word echoing louder than it should have, because it was not just about connection, it was about value, about position, about something he had once assumed belonged to him. Without question, the woman at his side withdrew her hand from his arm completely, now her posture subtly distancing, as if she too could feel the shift and did not want to be caught in it. Ryan noticed, but did not react, not outwardly. Instead, he focused on maintaining the image he had built, the one that had never been challenged like this before. "That is unexpected," he said with a small, controlled smile, though it no longer reached his eyes. Evelyn looked at him, then not sharply, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet steadiness that felt almost unfamiliar to him now. "Not everything needs to be expected to be real," she said, and the simplicity of it left no room for dismissal, no room for argument, just a truth placed gently but firmly between them. And in that moment, Ryan understood something he had not allowed himself to consider before. This was not a coincidence, this was not an accident of timing, this was something she had stepped into willingly, calmly, deliberately, and whatever role he thought he had written for her tonight no longer existed, because Evelyn Carter was no longer playing the part he had given her, and the realization settled deeper than anything that had come before, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. The room did not return to normal after that, it only pretended to, as conversations resumed in softer tones and glasses touched again with less certainty than before, while Ryan stood there recalculating every assumption he had walked in with, because nothing about this situation fit the version of control he had built his confidence on, and yet he refused to let it collapse, not here, not in front of everyone. "It is a small world," he said after a moment, his voice carefully measured, as if he could still guide the narrative back into something familiar, something manageable. Sebastian did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting briefly across the room before returning, not dismissive, just patient, as if he allowed others to fill silence when they needed to reveal themselves, and Ryan felt that pause more than he expected. It stretched just enough to make him aware of every eye that might still be watching, even when pretending not to. Evelyn remained composed beside them, her posture relaxed, her presence no longer reactive, but grounded, as if she was not standing inside Ryan's event, but simply passing through it on her own terms. "You could say that," Sebastian replied, finally, his tone even, but there was a quiet finality in it that did not invite further framing. Ryan gave a small nod, though it felt less like agreement and more like acknowledgement of something he could not redirect. "Well then, I hope you are enjoying the evening," he added, attempting to regain a tone of hospitality, but it came out thinner than intended, like a line that had lost its weight somewhere along the way. Sebastian's expression remained unchanged. "I came for a reason," he said, and while the words were simple, they carried a precision that settled heavily into the space between them, because they were not about the event, not about business, not about courtesy. Ryan felt that shift immediately, his shoulders tightening almost imperceptibly as his mind moved to interpret what that reason could be, and before he could ask, Evelyn spoke, her voice calm, steady, not raised, but impossible to ignore. "And I accepted for the same reason," she said, her eyes meeting Ryan's, not with challenge, not with defiance, but with clarity, and in that moment something aligned, something that made the entire evening reframe itself, not as a coincidence, not as an unexpected encounter, but as a choice, two choices intersecting in a place Ryan believed he controlled. The realization pressed deeper, now no longer a flicker, but something more solid. Something that unsettled him in a way he could not easily conceal. The woman who had been standing beside him shifted back half a step, her presence fading into the background, as if even she understood that whatever was happening here no longer included her. Ryan noticed, but did not turn. Instead, he focused entirely on Evelyn and Sebastian, as if understanding them could restore something he had lost. "You planned this," he said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them, not accusatory. Not loud, just a statement forming too late. Evelyn did not react to the implication. She did not deny it, she did not confirm it. She simply held his gaze for a brief second longer before letting a faint, almost imperceptible smile touch her lips. "No," she said softly. "I just stopped avoiding places that once made me small." And the difference in that answer was subtle but undeniable, because it removed him from the center of her decision entirely. It was not about him anymore, it never had been, and that realization settled heavier than anything else as the space between them grew, not in distance, but in meaning. And Ryan understood then that whatever came next would not be something he could prepare for, because the script he had written no longer applied, and the woman standing in front of him was no longer someone he could define. The air in the ballroom no longer felt like it belonged to Ryan. It moved differently now, slower, heavier, as if every breath carried the weight of something unspoken. And he could feel it pressing against him from every direction, not loud, not obvious, but constant, the kind of pressure that did not need attention to exist. He adjusted his stance subtly, his shoulders straightening, his chin lifting just enough to suggest control, but the shift was no longer convincing, not to those watching closely, and certainly not to Evelyn. She stood exactly where she had been, her presence unchanged, her composure untouched by the tension that now circled around them like a tightening frame. Sebastian remained beside her, not closer, not distant, simply aligned, and that alignment said more than any declaration ever could. Ryan glanced briefly around the room, catching fragments of attention. People pretending to return to their conversations, but their eyes drifting back, their curiosity no longer hidden. And in that moment, he understood something he had not anticipated. This was no longer private. This was no longer a quiet exchange. This was visible, and visibility meant consequence. "I did not realize this evening would turn into a reunion," he said, his voice measured, but there was a sharper edge beneath it now, something less controlled, more reactive, as if he needed to reclaim ground that kept slipping beneath him. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in consideration, as if weighing the meaning behind his words before responding. "It is not a reunion if only one person is looking back," she said calmly, and the sentence landed with a quiet precision that drew a few nearby breaths to a pause. Ryan felt it immediately, the shift from conversation to something closer, to exposure, not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. He let out a soft laugh, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "You always did know how to make things sound final," he replied, attempting to soften the moment, to turn it into something lighter, something easier to dismiss. But the effort did not settle the way he intended, because Evelyn did not follow him there. She did not step into the space he was trying to create. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, grounded, unmovable, and that made his words feel smaller than he expected. Sebastian observed the exchange without interruption, his expression composed but attentive, as if every detail mattered, even the ones no one else noticed. And when he finally spoke, his voice did not rise, but it carried through the space with a quiet authority that shifted attention instantly. "Final is not the same as finished," he said, and the distinction settled into the room like a subtle correction, one that did not challenge Ryan directly, but reframed the entire moment. Ryan turned toward him, his expression tightening for just a fraction of a second before smoothing again. "And what would you call this then?" he asked, the question controlled, but no longer casual. Sebastian held his gaze evenly. "Clarity," he replied, and there was no hesitation, no room for reinterpretation, just a single word that closed more doors than it opened. Evelyn's eyes moved briefly between them, not caught, not conflicted, simply aware, and then she looked back at Ryan. And in that look, there was no anger, no regret, only distance, the kind that could not be crossed by explanation or apology. And in that distance, Ryan finally saw it, not just that she had changed, but that she had moved beyond the version of the world where he was the center of anything, and that realization settled deeper than anything said out loud, because it did not ask for acknowledgement, it simply existed, and the room felt it, even if they could not name it, because something had ended here, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with a quiet, unmistakable shift that no one could undo. The word clarity did not fade, it lingered in the air long after Sebastian said it, settling into every corner of the room, like something permanent, something that could not be undone, and Ryan felt it more than he wanted to. Admit because clarity meant there was no room left for interpretation, no space to twist the moment back into something that favored him. He let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening, just slightly, as he looked between them, trying to find the angle that still belonged to him. But there was none left, not here, not anymore. You speak like everything is already decided. He said, his tone quieter, now, less performative, more personal, as if the audience around them had started to disappear, even though they were still there watching, waiting. Evelyn met his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady, but softer than before, not out of sympathy, but out of certainty. It is not about deciding, she said, it is about seeing things the way they have been all along. And there was something in the way she said it that made it impossible to argue, because it did not accuse, it did not demand, it simply existed as truth. Ryan looked at her for a moment longer than he intended, searching for something familiar, something he could still recognize. But what he found instead was distance, not cold, not harsh, just complete, the kind of distance that does not ask to be crossed. Sebastian shifted slightly beside her, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just present in a way that reinforced everything without needing to interrupt. Ryan, he said, and the use of his name was calm, deliberate, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with volume. Ryan straightened, instinctively responding to it before he could stop himself. There are moments in business and in life when you realize you have been standing in the wrong place. Sebastian continued, his tone, even his gaze steady. The important part is whether you recognize it before it costs you something you cannot recover. The room did not move, no one spoke, because even those who did not understand the full context could feel the shift. The conversation was no longer about the past. It was about position, about awareness, about consequence. Ryan felt it settle into him deeper than anything that had been said before, because it was no longer subtle, it was no longer implied, it was direct, not as an attack, but as a fact. Evelyn did not look at Sebastian as he spoke. She kept her eyes on Ryan, not to challenge him, not to witness his reaction, but because this moment did not belong to anyone else. It had never been about proving something to the room. It had always been about closing something that no longer had a place in her life. Ryan exhaled slowly, his composure still intact on the surface, but beneath it something had shifted, something he could not easily rebuild. I see, he said finally, the words quiet, controlled, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. And for the first time that night, it sounded less like confidence and more like acknowledgement, not defeat, not yet, but the beginning of something he could not avoid. Evelyn gave a small nod, not in agreement, not in approval, just in recognition, as if the moment had reached the point it was always meant to reach. And then, without urgency, without hesitation, she turned slightly, her attention moving away from him, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that whatever needed to be said had already been said, and nothing more was required. And in that simple movement, the entire room understood something without needing it explained. This was not a confrontation, this was not a victory declared out loud, this was something quieter, something far more final, because Evelyn Carter was no longer standing in his story, and for the first time Ryan realized he was no longer standing in hers either. The music found its rhythm again, but it no longer mattered, not the soft piano, not the low hum of conversation, not the carefully curated elegance of the room, because something invisible had already shifted beyond repair, and Evelyn could feel it in the way the air no longer pressed against her, the way every step she took felt lighter, not because the room had changed, but because she moved forward without hesitation, her heels gliding across the marble floor with quiet certainty, and Sebastian fell in a step beside her, not leading, not following, just present in a way that did not ask for attention, yet commanded it all the same. No one stopped them, no one spoke, as they passed, only subtle glances and lowered voices trailing behind like echoes of a moment no one would openly discuss, but none would forget. Ryan remained where he stood, his posture still composed, his expression still controlled, but something behind his eyes had shifted, something that no longer matched the image he had spent years perfecting. He watched her walk away, not with anger, not even with regret, but with something far more unfamiliar, the realization that there was nothing left for him to reach back to, nothing left to reclaim. Evelyn did not look over her shoulder. She did not slow her pace. She did not acknowledge the silence she left behind, because this was not an exit meant to be seen. It was simply a continuation of a life that no longer required permission. As they reached the edge of the ballroom, the doors opened before them, and the cooler air from outside slipped in, brushing against her skin, a quiet contrast to the warmth she was leaving behind. And for a brief moment, she paused not out of hesitation, but awareness, the kind that comes when something finally settles into place. Sebastian glanced at her, not questioning, not urging, just present. And in that stillness, she allowed herself a single breath deeper than the ones before, not to steady herself, but to recognize what had already become true. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low, calm. As always, Evelyn let her gaze drift forward beyond the doorway, beyond the lights, beyond the version of herself that once stood in rooms like this waiting to be chosen. And when she answered, her voice carried none of the weight she used to carry, only clarity, only freedom. "I already am," she said softly, and then she stepped forward, the night air wrapping around her like something new, something earned, not given. Behind them, the doors closed, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to separate what was from what would never be again. Ryan remained inside, surrounded by the same room, the same people, the same life he had believed defined him. But now it felt different. Now it felt smaller, because for the first time he understood that the woman he once invited to be diminished had never truly lost anything at all. She had simply outgrown the place he thought she belonged. And as the sound of the evening resumed around him, unchanged on the surface, he stood there in the quiet center of it, realizing too late that she had not come back to be seen. She had come back to leave as someone he could never reach again. And somewhere beyond those closed doors, Evelyn Carter did not look back, because she had already won something far greater than the past. She had finally chosen herself.